The morning came on a wind that tasted of rust and distance. In the town of Dusty Bell, autumn did not so much arrive as it was scoured into existence by the grit blowing in from the plains, a fine red powder that settled into the grain of every board and the crease of every face. Nora Whitford felt it on her teeth as she guided her buckskin mare, Daisy, down the main street. The delivery satchel bounced a familiar rhythm against her hip, a counterpoint to the unsteady beat of the whispers that followed her like a second shadow. The Whitford girl, they said, still unmarried. She kept her chin level, her gaze fixed between Daisy's ears. The words were nothing new. Thorns on a path she had walked for years. At 26, she was a feature of the town's landscape, permanent and unplucked. She passed the bell and lantern, its bat-wing doors lying open like a mouth in a silent jeer. A cluster of men occupied the porch chairs, their boots propped on the railing, their morning already steeped in the smell of stale beer and chewing tobacco. One of them, a mule skinner named Silas, tipped his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than respect. He declared to the others, loud enough for the entire street to hear, that Nora Whitford was too stubborn to marry any man. The others laughed. A coarse, rumbling sound. "A man should know his place," another added, "and a woman hers." Nora pulled Daisy to a halt. She turned in the saddle, a slow, deliberate movement, and offered them a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She supposed that was true. She called back, her voice clear and steady. The problem was that most men she met seemed to think their place was right in her way. The laughter that followed was different, a little less certain. She nudged Daisy onward, the small victory tasting like ash. The wit was a shield, but the hurt was a quiet, persistent ache just beneath it. Pride was a lonely meal. Later that day, the town gathered for a public auction, a necessary ritual of commerce and gossip. Nora stood near the back, her hands clasped tight in front of her. The item for bid was the lease to the Whitford water landing, a small but vital strip of creek access her family had held for 2 generations. Her father, Abel, should have been there, but his hands had grown too gnarled with arthritis and his spirit too brittle with worry. So Nora stood in his place, a solitary woman in a sea of men, listening to the auctioneer's patter as he tried to wring bids from cautious pockets. The offers were insultingly low. Men who had known her father for decades now saw an opportunity, a weakness to be exploited. They were circling. Then a new voice cut through the lowball offers, calm and even. It came from a man she did not recognize, standing near the old cottonwood. He was tall and lean, dressed in practical, travel-worn clothes that suggested he was just passing through. He made a bid, not an extravagant one, but a respectable one, a figure that jolted the proceedings back toward fairness. The other bidders were forced to raise their own offers. The man never bid again. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as the price climbed to a sum that was honest. Nora secured the lease, her relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting. After the auctioneer brought down his gavel, Nora approached the stranger. She had to know. He saw her coming and waited, his gaze direct. She thanked him for his assistance, though she noted he did not seem the sort who needed more water rights. He gave a slight cant of his head, acknowledging her point. He said his name was Matthew. He told her a fair price is everyone's business. It keeps a town from souring. They spoke for a few moments more, a sparse exchange that felt more significant than an hour of polite chatter. He did not talk down to her or treat her as a curiosity. He spoke to her as an equal. In his eyes, she saw not the Whitford spinster, but a person. It was a novel and strangely unsettling feeling. There was a mutual respect in their shared directness, a recognition of substance beneath a rough surface. The relief of the morning dissolved when she returned home. She found her father at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, a stack of papers spread before him. The ledger was open, and the numbers told a story of quiet desperation. Abel explained the situation, his voice a dry rasp. A loan taken out 2 years ago, for seed and a new plow, had become a monster. Judge Pike, a man whose piety was as thin as his smile, held the note. Citing a clause buried in the fine print, he had raised the interest rate, retroactively. The amount they owed had doubled overnight. It was a sum they could never hope to repay. The final payment was due in a month. It was not business. It was a death sentence delivered on legal paper. As if summoned by the scent of despair, Gideon March appeared at their door that evening. He was the wealthiest man in the county, with holdings in mining and timber that spread like a stain across the map. He was handsome, in a severe, predatory way, his clothes perfectly tailored, his manners impeccable. He entered their small home as if he owned it, his presence shrinking the very air in the room. He expressed his deepest sympathies for their plight, his voice a smooth balm that did not soothe. He had heard of their trouble with Judge Pike, and, as a friend of the family, he wanted to help. He laid out his proposal on the table, next to the damning loan papers. It was simple, he said, a transaction of mutual benefit. He would absorb Abel's entire debt, wipe it clean from the books. In exchange, Nora would agree to become his wife. He spoke of it as a merger of assets, a sensible arrangement. When he saw the look on Nora's face, a blaze of fury and disbelief, he amended his offer with a placid smile. If marriage was not to her liking, there was another option. He would take the Whitford water landing as collateral. Full ownership transferred to him upon cancellation of the debt. He would be saving them. He insisted. Nora stood up, her hands flat on the table. She told him directly that her hand was not a piece of property to be traded, and her family's legacy was not for sale to a vulture. Her voice did not tremble. She looked him square in the eye, and for a moment, the polite mask slipped, revealing the cold ambition beneath. Gideon March was not accustomed to being told no. He inclined his head, the smile returning, colder than before. He hoped she would reconsider. He murmured, before her father's sentimentality cost them everything. Then he was gone, leaving the threat hanging in the air like smoke. A few days later, Nora was making a delivery to the freight office at the edge of town, a heavy crate of mining equipment ordered by Gideon March's company. As one of the freight handlers moved it, a poorly nailed board gave way, and the crate tipped, spilling some of its contents onto the dusty platform. In the jumble of tools and canvas sacks, a small, black book lay half-hidden. It was a ledger, bound in cheap leather. Thinking it was part of the freight company's paperwork, Nora picked it up to return it. It fell open in her hands. The page was filled with meticulous, spidery script. It was a record of payments. Her eyes scanned the columns of dates and figures. Then she saw the names. Gideon March, Judge Pike. Again and again, they appeared together. Beside the entries were short, cryptic notes, mercury permits, waste runoff, creek access. It was all there, a meticulous account of bribery. Gideon was paying the judge to look the other way, to sign permits that allowed his mining operations to dump toxic mercury waste into the same water systems that fed the creeks and wells of the valley. He was poisoning the land for profit, and the judge was his paid accomplice. The debt her father owed was not just a loan. It was a leash, a tool to acquire the water rights Gideon needed to continue his ruinous operation. Her breath caught in her throat. The book was dynamite. It was proof. It was also, she knew with chilling certainty, a death warrant for whoever possessed it. She looked around. The freight handlers were busy with another wagon, their backs to her, without a second thought. Nora slipped the ledger into her empty delivery satchel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the flap shut, her mind racing. This changed everything. She had stumbled upon a secret that could destroy the most powerful men in the region, and they, in turn, would not hesitate to destroy her to keep it. She concealed the book in a loose stone of her hearth, a cold weight in the heart of her home. Meanwhile, in the county seat, another transaction was taking place. one conducted without fanfare. Matthew entered the Territorial Bank, the same bank where Judge Pike served on the board of directors. He did not speak to the judge. He spoke to a junior clerk in a quiet corner. He presented paperwork establishing a trust, an anonymous entity with an address in the East. On behalf of this trust, he inquired about purchasing outstanding agricultural loans. He was particularly interested in a certain note held against one Abel Whitford. The clerk, seeing the amount of capital Matthew was prepared to wire, was more than happy to oblige. Judge Pike's predatory loan was bought, paid in full by the anonymous trust. The clerk stamped the document, and the power the judge held over the Whitford family vanished with the thud of ink on paper. Matthew left as quietly as he had arrived, his face giving nothing away. The immediate threat of foreclosure was gone, though Nora and her father had no idea. The battle lines were now drawn, some in plain sight, others in secret. Nora was caught in a web of conflicts. She stood against Gideon March and Judge Pike, two powerful men who would crush her without a thought. She stood against the stifling expectations of a society that saw her only as a spinster in need of a husband. And now, unknown to her, she stood in the shadow of a quiet protector, a situation that would soon challenge her fiercest and most cherished possession, her own stubborn independence. She did not want to be saved. She wanted to fight. That evening, Nora walked down to the creek that bordered their property. She watched the last light of the sun catch the water, turning it to a ribbon of molten copper. A few yards away, an old prospector swirled water and sand in his pan, his back bent in a timeless posture of hope. She watched as he tilted the pan, letting the worthless gravel wash away, left behind. Clinging to the dark, wet metal was a barely visible scattering of tiny, gleaming specks. It was not a fortune. It was not even a day's wages, but it was there, a faint, almost illusory shimmer of gold in a pan full of mud, a fragile promise. She stood there for a long time, the cool evening air settling around her as the first stars appeared in the vast, indifferent sky. The first sign of the deeper sickness came not with a bang, but with a stillness. It was Sarah, a young woman who had learned her healing from her Paiute grandmother, who first brought the worry to Nora. She spoke of a fever among the children down by Ash Creek, a listlessness that did not break, and a strange, metallic taste in the water. Nora went with her, along with the town's stoic Reverend Michael, a man whose faith was more in works than in words. What they found silenced them. The creek, normally teeming with small fish and water striders, was unnaturally clear, the water flowing over a sterile, dead bottom along the banks. A dozen trout lay belly up, their gills a sickly brown. The children they visited were pale and quiet, their eyes holding a feverish glaze. Sarah pointed to a rash on a small boy's arms, a faint red tracery on his skin. It was the mercury. Nora knew it with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut. The names in the ledger, Gideon and Pike, were no longer just names on a page. They were the authors of this poison. Armed with a righteous fury, Nora did not wait. She rode directly to the sprawling headquarters of the March Mining Company, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep in her satchel. She was shown into Gideon March's office, a room of polished mahogany and thick carpets that seemed to swallow the sound of the dusty world outside. He greeted her with the same predatory civility as before. Offering her a seat, she refused to take. She stood before his massive desk and removed the ledger from her bag. She did not open it to the first page. She opened it to a page in the middle, one detailing a series of payments to Judge Pike for waste runoff permits. She laid it on his desk, the spidery script a stark accusation against the polished wood. She told him about the children. She told him about the dead fish. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the facts, her words as cold and hard as river stones. She demanded he halt all operations at the mine immediately, until an independent assay could be done on the water. Gideon's face, for a fleeting moment, was a mask of pure violence. The civility vanished, and she saw the man who would poison children for profit. He recovered quickly, his lips tightening into a bloodless smile. He called her a thief, He told her she was playing a game she could not possibly win. She held his gaze. She replied that it was not a game. She then placed a single, dead trout on top of the open ledger. The smell of decay filled the opulent room. He looked from the fish to her face, and his eyes were chips of ice. He agreed. He would suspend the work, for now. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. A low and venomous promise. He swore to her that she would pay for this. Not in coin, but in ruin. Word of the mine's closure spread through Dusty Bell like a grass fire. 2 days later, Matthew found Nora sweeping the porch of her family's general store. He leaned against a post, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful. He said he had heard she had picked a fight with a grizzly bear. He had a proposition. He knew the families along the creek were losing livestock and missing work to care for their sick. He suggested a collective lawsuit against March Mining. The families did not have the resources, but he did. He offered to cover all legal costs and provide logistical support, even paying the families a fair wage for any time they lost attending hearings or giving testimony. It was a sound plan, logical and powerful. But Nora looked at him and saw another man of means, another man trying to take control. She was suspicious of his motives. Why would a stranger, a man who seemed to have considerable wealth, involve himself so deeply in their small town's troubles? She asked him what his stake was. He simply said he did not like bullies. The answer was too simple. She saw it as a bid for power, perhaps an attempt to drive Gideon out so he could take over the mining interests himself. She thanked him for the offer, but refused it flatly. This was their fight, she said, and they would see it through on their own terms. He did not argue. He only watched her with a look of quiet disappointment before turning and walking away. That night, the sky was a blanket of black velvet, moonless and close. Nora was woken from a shallow sleep by the frantic ringing of the fire bell. From her window, she saw it, a terrifying orange glow against the darkness. It was the warehouse behind the general store. She dressed in a blind panic, her mind racing. The warehouse held more than just grain and tools. In a locked iron box in the small office, she kept the store's account books, the records of credit that kept half the town's families afloat through lean times. It was the lifeblood of their community, a fragile trust recorded in ink. She could not let it burn. When she reached the store, a bucket brigade was already forming, a hopelessly thin line against the roaring inferno. The warehouse was fully engulfed, flames licking up the sides and pouring through the roof. The heat was a physical blow. The sheriff tried to hold her back, but she slipped past him, her mind fixed on one thing. She pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth and ran through the side door into the office. The room was thick with blinding, choking smoke. Heat pressed in from the other side of the wall, the wood already groaning. She found the iron box, heavy and hot to the touch. She struggled to lift it, her lungs screaming for air. A timber crashed down from the ceiling, blocking the doorway, showering the room in a cascade of sparks. She was trapped. A wave of terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. Then a figure loomed in the smoke-filled doorway, a dark shape against the terrifying orange light. It was Matthew. He kicked away the burning timber without hesitation and moved toward her. She tried to tell him about the box, but her words came out as a ragged cough. He did not need to be told. He took the heavy box from her with one arm and scooped her up with the other as if she weighed nothing at all. He turned and carried her back through the doorway, shielding her body with his own as they passed beneath the burning lintel. He did not stop until they were across the street, clear of the heat and the smoke and the shouting men. He set her down gently. Her legs felt weak, and she was coughing, her throat raw. She looked up at him. His face was smudged with soot, and there was a small, angry burn on his cheek. But his gaze was steady. For the first time, they were standing close, the chaos of the fire creating a strange pocket of stillness around them. She had to say something to break the spell, to push back against the overwhelming fact that he had just saved her life. She told him she had it under control. A corner of his mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. He said the fire seemed to disagree. The shared moment of dry wit was a shield for them both, a way to manage the tremor of adrenaline and the startling, unexpected feeling of being held in his arms. Later, after the warehouse had collapsed into a smoldering ruin, Matthew walked her home through the quiet, smoke-hazed streets. At her gate, he paused. He took the oil lamp he was carrying and set it on the railing of her front porch. The flame inside the glass chimney threw a small, steady circle of light onto the worn boards. He told her it had plenty of oil. He said that if she needed anything, all she had to do was knock. The gesture was simple, a practical kindness. Yet it felt profound. It was an offer of help without conditions, a light left on in the darkness, leaving the choice to accept it entirely to her. She watched him walk away until his silhouette disappeared into the night. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time, the iron box of account books safe beside her. The fear from the fire had subsided, replaced by a sharp and uncomfortable self-reproach. She had nearly died. For a box of paper. For pride. For the desperate, suffocating need to prove she could handle everything on her own. His rescue, his quiet offer of help, had exposed the flaw in her armor. Her independence, the thing she valued most, had become a kind of prison, a fortress so well built it was in danger of starving its lone occupant. The next day, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-gray, and the air grew heavy and still. Then the storm broke. It was a tempest of unnatural ferocity. Thunder that shook the house to its foundations and rain that fell in solid, blinding sheets. In the midst of the deluge, a rider galloped into town, soaked and shouting. The wooden dam at the mine, weakened by neglect, was cracking under the pressure of the rain-swollen reservoir behind it. If it gave way, a wall of poisoned water and mining sludge would surge down the valley, wiping out everything in its path, starting with the farms and homesteads in the lowlands, starting with the Whitford place. As Nora stood on her porch, watching the creek rise with terrifying speed, another figure emerged from the downpour. It was Sheriff Brody, his face grim. He was not alone. 2 deputies waited behind him on horseback. The sheriff trudged up her steps, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked her in the eye, and she saw genuine regret in his expression. He held up a folded, damp piece of paper. It was a warrant. He said, signed by Judge Pike an hour ago. Gideon March had filed a formal complaint. He was charging her with the theft of private property. The sheriff told her he had no choice. Nora Whitford was under arrest. She stood frozen, trapped between the rising flood, the coming poison, and the long arm of a corrupted law. The steady little flame in Matthew's lamp flickered wildly in the wind. The storm passed as violently as it had arrived, leaving a world washed clean and raw. But as the sun climbed, it baked the wet earth, and the wind began its work again, lifting the topsoil into the air. By the time Sheriff Brody escorted Nora to the town square, a fine red dust was blowing, a haze that blurred the edges of the buildings and coated every surface with a film of grit. Justice in Dusty Bell was not to be found in a courthouse, but on the wide, warped porch of the Bell and Lantern Saloon, with Judge Pike presiding from a sturdy table and the entire town assembled in the street as jury and audience. The air was thick with the smells of damp earth, horses, and nervous sweat. Nora stood before the table, her father beside her, his face a mask of worried helplessness. Gideon March stood to the side, looking confident and aggrieved, a man of substance wronged by a hysterical woman. The charge was theft, simple and clean. Judge Pike began the proceedings with a theatrical clearing of his throat, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. He called the charge against Miss Nora Whitford, and Gideon's lawyer presented the case. She had been seen near the crate. The ledger had gone missing. It was found in her possession. It was an open and shut case of a disgruntled debtor seeking leverage through criminal means. When Nora was given the chance to speak, she did not deny taking the book. She admitted it freely. She said she took it because it was evidence of a far greater crime. She held up a sealed glass jar of water from Ash Creek, a faint, cloudy suspension visible within. She spoke of the sick children, the dead livestock, the poisoned land. She accused Gideon March of bribery and Judge Pike of complicity, her voice ringing with a conviction that momentarily silenced the crowd. Judge Pike let her finish. A thin, bloodless smile touched his lips. He rapped his knuckles on the table. He informed Miss Whitford that this was a hearing about the theft of a private ledger, not a public forum for wild, unsubstantiated accusations. The jar of water was irrelevant. The contents of a stolen book were, by definition, inadmissible. He waved his hand dismissively. The evidence was disallowed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a neat legal trap, and she had walked right into it. She stood there, her proof rendered useless, her accusations turned to air. The red dust swirled, a curtain falling between her and any hope of a fair hearing. It was then that Matthew stepped forward. He had been standing near the back, watching silently. He addressed the judge, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise. He said he wished to offer testimony relevant to the context of the alleged crime. Pike, annoyed by the interruption but legally obligated, asked what he could possibly have to say. Matthew did not look at Nora. He looked at Gideon March. He began to speak, not of the ledger, but of geology. He spoke of quartz veins and hydraulic pressure, of stamp mills and mercury amalgamation. He described, in precise, technical detail, how a large-scale mining operation might cut corners, creating unlined slurry ponds that would inevitably leach heavy metals into the subterranean water table. He spoke as a man who knew the earth from the inside out. He then unrolled a large sheet of canvas on the ground. On it was a map, drawn with charcoal and ink, of the entire valley. It was a work of astonishing detail. He had mapped the network of underground aquifers, the secret rivers flowing beneath their feet. He pointed with a stick, tracing a line from Gideon's mine, showing with irrefutable logic how a contamination point there would surface, miles away, directly in Ash Creek. He was no longer just a well-dressed stranger. He was an expert, and his testimony hung in the air, a scientific certainty that could not be dismissed as the ravings of a desperate woman. Gideon March was too smart to challenge Matthew on the facts. He chose a different weapon. He leaned over and whispered to his lawyer, who then called one of Gideon's hired men from the crowd. The man shuffled forward, twisting his hat in his hands, and spoke of seeing Miss Whitford and this stranger, Matthew, in quiet conversation more than once. He spoke of the fire, how Matthew had carried her out. He planted the seed, and Gideon's allies in the crowd began to water it. The whispers changed direction. This was not about poison. This was about a spinster trying to catch a rich husband, an outsider with money. She was using this trouble to get his attention, to force him to play the hero and win her gratitude, perhaps even a proposal. It was a story the town understood far better than it understood geology. The old taunt returned, louder this time, passed from man to man on the porch of the saloon. Too stubborn to marry. The words were a physical blow to Nora, stripping away her credibility, reducing her fight for justice to a desperate, pathetic romantic scheme. Her face burned with humiliation. She felt the eyes of the whole town on her, not with sympathy, but with a familiar, pitying scorn. She was just the Whitford girl, after all, always reaching for things that were not hers. She stood alone, isolated in a sea of judgment. In that moment of chaos, with the dust swirling and the crowd's jeers rising, Matthew turned. He did not look at the judge or at Gideon or at the leering faces on the porch. He looked directly at Nora. The entire square seemed to fall silent, waiting. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with an absolute, unwavering clarity that silenced every other sound. "They say you are too stubborn to marry," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I call your courage the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The words landed in the dusty square like a benediction. It was not a defense. It was a testament. He had taken their ugliest word for her. Stubborn, and recast it as her greatest virtue. Courage, He had seen her, not the spinster, not the troublemaker, but the woman herself, and he had named what he saw as beautiful. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. Nora felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, hot and sharp. It was a feeling more complex and overwhelming than gratitude, a dizzying mix of validation and fury. Judge Pike, his face a mask of thunder, slammed his hand on the table, breaking the spell. He declared the proceedings had become a circus. He needed time to consider the testimony. He would render his verdict in 1 week. Until then, as the accused was clearly a flight risk and the subject of the original loan was in dispute, he was placing the Whitford water landing under the temporary receivership of the court. With a final bang of his fist, he adjourned the hearing. The crowd began to disperse, talking in excited, confused knots. Gideon March shot a look of pure hatred at Matthew before turning on his heel and stalking away. Nora's father put a trembling arm around her, but she barely felt it. She was looking at Matthew, who was walking toward her through the thinning crowd. When he reached her, the anger she felt finally found its voice. It was a low, shaking fury. She thanked him for his testimony. Then she asked him who gave him the right to speak for her character in front of the entire town. She told him she was not some damsel in a storybook who needed a knight to praise her good qualities. She had a voice of her own. Her anger was a shield against the confusing vulnerability his words had created. She was furious at him for helping, and furious at herself for needing it. Matthew did not flinch from her anger. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He told her he was not speaking for her. He was speaking for himself. There was a difference. He said he would see her in a week, then turned and walked toward the livery stable, leaving her standing in the swirling red dust. The echo of his words still ringing in her ears. A man who had declared her beautiful for the very thing the world had always condemned her for. The week that followed was a strange truce, a holding of breath. The red dust settled, but the town remained divided, split by whispers and Matthew's public declaration. Nora felt the shift in how people looked at her. Some saw a hero, others a fool, but no one saw just the Whitford spinster anymore. She knew this fragile stalemate could not last. Action was required. She found Matthew at the livery, checking the shoes on his horse, his movements economical and sure. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him that if they were to work together, it would not be based on grand gestures in the town square. It would be an alliance. And alliances required terms. He stopped his work and gave her his full attention. Standing there, amidst the scent of hay and horsehide, Nora laid out her conditions. She would cooperate, share what she knew from the ledger, and help him rally the families, but only if he agreed to a formal, written contract. He listened, his face impassive. The contract would state that their goal was not simply to replace Gideon March with another mine owner. Any legal victory, any settlement or change of ownership must include 2 non-negotiable provisions. First, a percentage of the mine's future profits would be set aside to establish a permanent medical fund for the entire community, to treat those already sick and any who might fall ill in the future. Second, the miners themselves would be offered a share in the profits, a stake in the wealth they pulled from the earth. They would be partners, not just hired labor. She looked him in the eye, her final condition laid bare. If he ever broke the terms of the agreement, she would not hesitate to use the ledger against him. Just as she was using it against Gideon, she would make his treachery public. It was a threat and a promise. She expected him to hesitate, to negotiate. Instead, he simply looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been respect. He told her to write it up. That evening, he came to the general store, in the quiet lamplight, on the main counter. Nora placed the handwritten document between them. It was written in plain language, clear and binding. He read it once, slowly. Then he picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed his name at the bottom with a steady, decisive hand. He did not flinch. He did not add a single word. He slid the paper back to her, the ink still wet. The contract was sealed. Their first move required a trip to the county seat, 30 miles north, to file the legal paperwork for the family's collective suit and to hire an independent assayer Matthew knew by reputation. They set out at dawn 2 days later, Nora on Daisy and Matthew on his sturdy gray gelding. The air had a sharp, crystalline edge, and the sky to the west was the color of a dull pewter bowl. By midday, the temperature had dropped, and the first flakes of snow began to drift from the heavy clouds, melting as they touched the ground. Within an hour, the lazy flakes had become a thick, swirling curtain of white, driven by a rising wind. The trail ahead vanished. They were caught in the first blizzard of the season, a sudden, violent storm that had no place in early autumn. Matthew knew of a place, a small trapper's cabin turned way station called Aurora, nestled in a sheltered pass a few miles off the main trail. It was their only chance. They turned their horses into the wind, heads bowed against the stinging snow. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of white. Just when Nora began to think they were lost, a plume of smoke appeared through the blizzard, a fragile gray line against the whiteout. The cabin was small and rough, built of chinked logs, but the smoke promised a fire, and a fire promised life. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine smoke and brewing coffee. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, a beacon of warmth against the storm's fury. The station keeper, an old man named Elias with a beard like a snowdrift, was glad for the company. He gave them stew and left them to themselves, retreating to his own small room at the back. The storm howled outside, a wild beast trying to get in. But inside the small cabin, there was a profound and welcome quiet. They sat near the fire, mugs of black coffee warming their hands. The tension of the past weeks, the legal battles and public scrutiny, seemed to belong to another world. Here, they were just two people seeking shelter from a storm. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the logs and the moan of the wind, to fill the quiet. Matthew got up to inspect the coffee pot. He remarked that Elias made coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. Nora smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. She replied that it was a known fact that most men in the West viewed cooking as a hostile act, a personal affront to their dignity. The banter was easy, a welcome relief. It was in this space of shared warmth and gentle humor that the walls she had so carefully built began to feel less like a fortress and more like a cage. She found herself telling him about her childhood, about learning to read ledgers at her father's knee, about a mother she barely remembered who had loved books. She spoke of the quiet pride she felt in keeping the store running, in being a necessary part of the community's fabric, and the constant, chafing frustration of being seen as incomplete without a husband. He listened, his attention a quiet, steady thing that invited confidence. In turn, he told her why he had come to Dusty Bell. He had not always been a man of means. Years ago, he had been a miner himself, a shift boss in a silver mine in Colorado. He spoke of the camaraderie of the men, the shared danger that forged bonds stronger than family. Then his voice grew quiet, and he stared into the flames. He described a day when the company, chasing a rich vein, had ignored the warning signs, the groaning of the timbers, the fine dust falling from the ceiling. A section of the tunnel had collapsed. He had been near the entrance and was thrown clear by the blast of air. Others were not so lucky. He had spent 3 days digging with his bare hands alongside the other survivors, pulling friends from the rubble. The memory was there, in his eyes, a shadow that the fire could not touch. He had inherited a small fortune from an uncle a year later and had vowed to use it to fight the kind of careless greed that had killed his friends. He was not just fighting Gideon March, he was fighting a ghost. Nora looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, the quiet stranger, the wealthy outsider, the man who had publicly defended her. All the pieces of him came together, forming a picture of a man shaped by loss and driven by a deeply personal code of honor. Her own struggles, which had always felt so large and singular, now felt like part of a larger, shared human story of trying to carve out a space for decency in a hard world. The fire was burning low, and the cabin had grown cooler. She shivered, and he rose to add another log to the hearth. When he turned back, the firelight caught the side of her face. A strand of her hair had come loose, and a small, blue ribbon she used to tie it back had begun to unravel. She reached up to fix it, her fingers clumsy in the dim light. He moved closer, his hand coming up to gently stop hers. He asked her to let him. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His fingers, calloused and strong, were surprisingly gentle as they gathered the stray lock of hair. He slowly, carefully, retied the simple ribbon into a neat bow. His touch was feather-light, a whisper against her skin. The small, ordinary gesture felt more intimate than any embrace. As he finished, his hands lingered for a second. He looked into her eyes, the firelight dancing in their depths. He said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. Living out here, courage is the most beautiful thing. The world shrank to the small space between them. The howling of the storm, the crackling fire. It all faded away. This time, the words were not a public declaration. They were a private truth, a gift offered from one soul to another. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was quiet, tentative, and deeply real. It was a question and an answer, a discovery of a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. It was a choice, made freely in the heart of a storm, a quiet and profound acceptance of a trust she had never thought she would be able to give. They broke apart slowly. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. In the shared quiet, a new understanding had been forged, as strong and as clearly defined as the contract he had signed. The morning broke clear and cold. The world outside transformed into a pristine landscape of white under a brilliant blue sky. The storm was over. As they prepared to leave, a lone rider approached the cabin, his horse struggling through the deep drifts. It was a young man from a neighboring ranch. His face was pale with exhaustion and fear. He brought terrible news. The storm had been too much. The wooden dam at the March mine had not just cracked, it had shattered. A great wall of gray, toxic sludge had been released. It was pouring down the valley, a slow-moving flood of poison, directly toward the low-lying ground where Gideon's main miners' camp was pitched. The men and their families had been sleeping in its path. There was no time for thought, only for the desperate, primal instinct to outrun disaster. Matthew and Nora rode hard, their horses plunging through the snow, pushing toward the valley floor. The sound reached them before the sight, a low, grinding roar, the sound of the earth itself coming undone. When they broke through the trees and saw it, the sight stole the breath from their lungs. It was not a wall of water, but a thick gray tongue of sludge, moving with a horrifying, relentless slowness. Studded with splintered timbers and uprooted trees, it oozed across the valley floor, consuming everything in its path, and directly in that path lay the miners' camp, a collection of tents and shacks where families were just beginning to stir, oblivious to the doom crawling toward them. Panic was a wild animal let loose in the camp. People ran in every direction, shouting, trying to gather children and belongings. The advance of the sludge was deceptively slow, giving them time to flee but not time to think. Nora saw the problem at once. The path to the high ground on the far side of the valley was long and circuitous. The sludge, though slow, would cut them off. But to her right, a steep, rocky bluff rose up, a sheer wall of granite. It was impassable for most, but she saw a narrow game trail, a series of switchbacks leading to a wide, protected ledge halfway to the top. It was their only chance. She spurred Daisy forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. She screamed for the women and children, pointing toward the bluff. Some were frozen with terror, but Nora rode directly into their midst, her presence a magnet of calm authority. She scooped a small, crying girl from the ground and passed her to a woman, shouting instructions, forcing them to move. Daisy, sure-footed and fearless, picked her way through the panicked crowd, herding them toward the narrow trail. Nora stayed at the rear, pushing them onward, her eyes fixed on the creeping edge of the gray flood. Matthew, meanwhile, had galloped in the opposite direction, toward a narrow point in the valley where a massive outcropping of rock nearly pinched the channel shut. He rode with a desperate urgency, his saddlebags bouncing heavily. He was not running from the flood. He was running to meet it. He reached the rock outcropping and dismounted, pulling sticks of dynamite and coils of fuse from his bags. His movements were a blur of expertise, born of a life spent in the belly of the earth. He worked with a cold, focused fury, placing the charges with precision, his mind calculating angles and force, the ghost of the Colorado mine disaster a spur in his side. Nora had gotten the last of the children onto the trail. She watched them scramble up the rocks to the safety of the ledge. The sludge was now alarmingly close, the roar of it filling the air. She could feel the ground vibrating. Looking across the valley, she saw Matthew, a tiny figure against the rock wall, lighting a fuse. He turned and ran, diving behind a cluster of boulders just as a deafening blast ripped through the air. The rock outcropping fractured, a huge section of it calving off and crashing down into the valley, forming a crude, temporary dam. The gray sludge hit the new barrier, its momentum broken. It began to pool, backing up on itself. Its direction shifted away from the camp and toward a stretch of empty floodplain. He had not stopped it, but he had diverted it. He had bought them time. From a high ridge, safe from the chaos, two men on horseback watched the scene unfold. Gideon March sat motionless, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched Matthew's gambit succeed. Beside him, Judge Pike looked pale and shaken, not by the disaster, but by the utter ruin of their plans. As they watched, a third group of riders, a survey team working for the railroad, crested the same ridge. They stopped, their faces grim, taking in the scene below the ruined dam, the diverted sludge, the huddled survivors on the cliff, and the two men who watched it all from a safe distance. The lead surveyor took out a notebook and began to write, his pen scratching across the page, a dispassionate, official record of Gideon March's callous indifference. Down in the valley, as the immediate danger passed, Judge Pike saw his opportunity to regain control. He and Gideon rode down from the ridge, arriving as Matthew was helping the last of the families from the bluff. Pike's voice boomed with false authority. He declared Matthew under arrest for the illegal transport and use of explosives, and Nora as his accomplice for creating a public panic. He was attempting to twist their heroism into a crime. But as the sheriff, who had just arrived, moved reluctantly to enforce the judge's order, a new voice rose from the crowd of soot-stained, mud-spattered miners. It was Evan, an old miner with a face like a road map of every tunnel he had ever worked. His hands were shaking, but his voice was clear with a terrible, unburdened certainty. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Gideon March. He said that there was another crime that needed answering for. He confessed, his voice cracking with guilt, that it was he who had set fire to the Whitford warehouse. He said he did it on Gideon's direct order, for a bonus of $50. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Gideon's face went white. He called Evan a liar, a drunk, but Evan was not finished. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, grimy piece of paper. It was a letter. He said, a receipt for the money. He could not read, so he had asked for a written note to be sure he was not cheated. He had taken it to the one man he thought he could trust to read it for him and confirm the amount. A man who had also demanded a small fee for his services and had marked the letter with his own seal to prove it was a valid debt. He held up the letter. On the bottom, next to Gideon's signature for payment, was the unmistakable wax seal of Judge Thaddeus Pike. The crowd erupted. The truth, raw and undeniable, was laid bare. Pike stood frozen, his face the color of ash. He was caught, exposed not just as a corrupt judge, but as an accessory to arson. Sheriff Brody looked from the letter to Pike, and all the reluctance in his posture hardened into resolve. The law had been broken, but not by Nora or Matthew. In the stunned aftermath, Matthew took the letter from Evan. He gathered the signed contract from Nora, his own hand-drawn map, and made a note to get the sworn affidavit from the railroad survey team. He now held a complete and damning portfolio of evidence, enough to destroy both Gideon and the judge. The power had shifted, irrevocably. That evening, as a temporary camp was being made on high ground, Nora stood and looked out over the valley. The toxic sludge had settled, a great, gray scar on the land. Here and there, in the fading light, she could see a faint, metallic glint on the surface of the muck. Fool's gold, worthless pyrite that had washed down from the mine. It was a perfect image of Gideon's legacy, a layer of glittering illusion over a deep and abiding poison. She held the black ledger in her hands. The evidence Matthew held was enough for the law, but the ledger told the deeper story, the slow poisoning of the land and the people. To release it would be to make an enemy for life, to invite a danger that would not end with a trial. She looked at the faces of the families huddled around their campfires, at the hope that flickered in their tired eyes. She made her choice. She would not hide behind Matthew's evidence. She would walk to the newspaper office in the county seat herself. She would publish the book. She would see the truth brought into the light, no matter the cost. Her stubbornness had brought her to this moment, and her courage would see her through it. The Reverend Michael did not need to be asked. That evening, he threw open the doors of his small church, not for a sermon, but for a reckoning. The pews were filled, not with the pious, but with the entire anxious population of Dusty Bell. They sat shoulder to shoulder, miners and merchants, wives and ranchers, their faces illuminated by the warm, flickering light of dozens of oil lamps. There was no pulpit, only a simple wooden table at the front, where Nora stood with Matthew, Sarah, and a handful of the miners, their faces grim and determined. The air was thick with anticipation. Nora spoke first. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the hushed space with its quiet, unshakable authority. She did not speak of theft or legal technicalities. She spoke of trust. She held up the black ledger. She told them how every family in that room was in the store's account books, a record of debts given and honored, a testament to their shared belief in one another. This book, she said, holding up the ledger, was the opposite. It was a record of trust broken, of poison sold for profit, of their shared home being slowly and deliberately destroyed. She read from its pages, her voice steady as she detailed the payments from Gideon to Pike, the dates corresponding with new permits for waste runoff. The spidery script became a chorus of damnation in the quiet church. When she finished, Matthew unrolled his hand-drawn map on the floor, weighting its corners with hymn books. He explained it again. Not as an expert witness, but as a neighbor, he showed them the secret ways of the water beneath their feet, how a poison at the mine was a poison in their own wells. He made the science plain, undeniable. Sarah then stepped forward. She held up the jar of cloudy water from Ash Creek, a relic of a dying stream. She did not speak of science. She spoke the names of the children who were sick. She spoke of fevers that would not break, of a listlessness that stole the light from their eyes. Her testimony was a quiet litany of grief, a mother's heartbroken prayer. Finally, Evan and two other miners stood. They spoke of Gideon's callous disregard for their safety, of faulty timbers and ignored warnings. They spoke of being cheated on the weigh-in for their ore, of a system designed to keep them in perpetual debt, chained to the company's store and the company's mercy, of which there was none. It was a tidal wave of truth, one testimony building on the next, until the guilt of the two men sitting alone in the front pew was as solid and real as the wooden walls of the church. Gideon March, for the first time, looked rattled. His empire, built on secrets and fear, was being dismantled before his eyes, not by a court, but by the people he had lorded over. His control was slipping. He stood up, his face contorted with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Evan. He called him a liar, A traitor. He started toward the old man, his hands clenched into fists, his intent clear. He would silence this rebellion with the only tool he had left, brute force. Before he could take 2 steps, Matthew was in his path. Matthew did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, a calm and immovable object. Gideon, blinded by fury, threw a wild punch. Matthew sidestepped it with an almost casual grace, caught Gideon's arm, and used his momentum to spin him around, pinning his arms behind his back in a hold that was both unbreakable and controlled. He did not strike him. He did not throw him to the ground. He held him, neutralizing the threat completely. He leaned in and spoke, his voice low but audible in the silent church. He said this was not a barroom. This was a place where truth was being told, and he would listen. He released Gideon with a firm shove that sent him stumbling back into his pew, humiliated and powerless. The display was more effective than any beating. It was a demonstration of discipline, of strength in the service of justice, not vengeance. All eyes then turned to Judge Pike. He sat shrunken in his seat, the authority drained from him, leaving only a pale, sweating man. The weight of every eye in that room was a physical force. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. He knew the testimony from the railroad surveyors would reach the territorial capital. A federal investigation was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. He was ruined, but like a cornered snake, he had one last drop of venom. He rose to his feet, pulling the last tattered shreds of his judicial authority around him. He announced that, as the highest legal power present, he was taking command of the situation. He accused Nora of inciting a riot, of slander against a respected businessman. With a quavering voice, he issued a final, desperate decree. He was signing an order of banishment. Nora Whitford was to be expelled from the county by sunrise. Her property forfeit. The crowd murmured in angry disbelief. Then Pike played his final, ugliest card. He offered a single path to clemency. He said the entire matter could be resolved as a private, domestic dispute if Miss Whitford would simply agree to the generous marriage proposal previously offered by Mr. March. Her acceptance, he declared, would merge her interests with his, nullifying her standing to make such complaints. He was offering her a choice between exile and a gilded cage, presenting her own subjugation as a magnanimous act of mercy. The entire church held its breath. It was a moment suspended in time. Gideon March, seeing a sliver of hope, straightened his coat, a smug, proprietary look returning to his face. Matthew took a half-step toward Nora, his expression a storm of protective fury. But Nora held up a hand, stopping him. She did not need anyone to fight this battle for her. She turned, not to the judge or to Gideon, but to the faces of the people in the pews, her people. She looked at the women, who knew the quiet compromises and the small surrenders of a world run by men. She looked at the miners, who knew the weight of a system built to crush them. Her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and as resonant as a bell. She said she would not be banished, and she would not be bought. Then she delivered the words that would forever define her, a declaration of independence for every soul in that room who had ever been told their worth was measured by who they belonged to. She looked directly at Judge Pike and said, "I do not need a man's name to have a right to respect." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a single woman in the back, the wife of a miner, stood up, then another, and another. Soon, all the women were on their feet, their faces a mixture of awe and fierce pride. Evan, the old miner, stood, and then his comrades joined him, their weary faces set with a new resolve. A wave of support rippled through the church, a silent, powerful tide rising against the 2 men in the front pew. They were no longer a crowd. They were a community, awakened and united. It was Reverend Michael who sealed the verdict. He walked slowly to the back of the church, to the thick rope that hung by the door. He took it in his hands and pulled. The deep, resonant toll of the church bell rang out. Once, twice, a third time, rolling across the valley. It was not a call to worship. It was a proclamation. The conscience of Dusty Bell was At long last, awake, Judge Pike stared, his face crumbling as the sound of his own irrelevance echoed in the rafters. Gideon March looked at the sea of faces turned against him and finally, truly, understood that he had lost. The bell tolled on, a clear, steady sound in the crisp night air, a sound of justice and of a stubborn, courageous woman who had refused to be silenced. The sound of the church bell was replaced by the silence of the morning after. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that follows a fever breaking. The town of Dusty Bell awoke to a world irrevocably changed. The lines of power, once etched in stone, had been washed away, leaving the community to find its new footing on uncertain ground. They did not have to wait long. 3 days later, 2 well-appointed carriages, escorted by a detachment of 4 territorial marshals, rolled down the main street. They were not dusty, travel-worn men. They were agents of federal authority, their clothes crisp, their faces serious, their presence a clear signal that the small, corrupt kingdom of Judge Pike had come to the attention of a much higher power. They carried with them a portfolio of documents sent by express courier, a packet mailed by Matthew from the county seat the day before the blizzard. The lead inspector, a man with a neat gray beard and eyes that missed nothing, convened a formal inquiry in the now liberated saloon. The proceedings were swift and brutal. The testimony from the railroad surveyors was presented, a dispassionate, damning account of Gideon's inaction during the flood. Evan's confession was taken under oath. The letter with Pike's seal was entered as official evidence, faced with the marshals and the threat of federal prison. Pike's remaining allies in the town bureaucracy crumbled, producing hidden ledgers and records that documented years of graft and falsified permits. Pike himself, stripped of his judicial robes, seemed to shrink before their eyes, a small, withered man whose authority had been nothing more than a costume. He was arrested for bribery, conspiracy, and perverting the course of justice. Gideon March's fall was just as swift. The mine, his source of power and wealth, was seized by the territorial government pending a full investigation. He was charged with arson, reckless endangerment, and the willful destruction of territorial waterways. As the marshals led him away in irons, he looked at Nora, his face a mask of venomous hatred. He was a man who had never known a single consequence, and the shock of it had unhinged him. His threats were a desperate, pathetic echo of the power he once held. In the midst of settling the legal chaos, the inspector addressed the matter of the Whitford property. He confirmed that the loan, and therefore the court's hold on the water landing, was invalid. A clerk read from a document detailing the loan's recent history. It had been purchased from the bank several weeks prior by a private entity, a trust based in the East. The clerk announced the name of the trust's sole signatory and legal agent, Matthew. A murmur went through the room. Nora stood perfectly still, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The quiet protector, the anonymous trust. It had been him all along. He had saved her family from Pike's trap before she even knew the full extent of the danger. He had acted in secret, a silent partner in her fight. After the inquiry concluded, she found him by the creek, skipping stones across the now clearing water. The anger she felt was old and familiar, the reflexive fury of a pride that had been her only shield for so long. She asked him why he had done it. Her voice was tight. She asked if he thought she was another one of his charitable causes, a problem to be solved with money. Matthew did not turn to face her. He watched a flat stone bounce 4 times before sinking into the current. He said it was not charity. He said he had learned a long time ago that you cannot fight a fire with just 1 bucket of water. You needed a whole town. You needed resources. You needed a plan. Then he turned, and his gaze was direct, holding no trace of pity, only a deep and abiding respect. He said it was an investment in a town that he was beginning to think was worth saving. He paused, his eyes holding hers, and, he added quietly, an investment in her courage. He had not bet on her weakness. He had bet on her strength. His words disarmed her. They were not the words of a rescuer, but of a partner, an investor who had seen value where others had only seen a liability. The old, fierce pride that had sustained her for so long felt suddenly brittle, inadequate. She walked away without another word, needing the silence to unravel the knot of feelings inside her. She returned to her family's store, the familiar scent of canvas and spices a comfort. She went about her tasks, weighing out flour, stacking tins, the simple, repetitive motions a balm to her racing thoughts. She thought of the journey she had been on, a path she had always believed she must walk alone. She thought of the fire, his arms carrying her through the smoke. She thought of the trial, his words cutting through the crowd's scorn. She thought of the blizzard, the quiet warmth of the cabin, the gentle way he had retied her hair. In all those moments, he had not taken from her. He had offered. He had placed a lamp on her porch but had left it to her to knock. He had presented evidence but had left it to her to speak her truth. He had bought her family's freedom but had left it to her to win the war, to accept help. She realized with a clarity that was like a sunrise in her soul, was not a sign of weakness. To accept a partnership, freely and with open eyes, was its own kind of strength. It was the strength to admit that one strand, no matter how tough, could be broken, but that two strands, braided together, were stronger than the sum of their parts. For the next hour, she sat on the porch, her hands busy with a task she had learned as a girl. She took 2 long, supple strips of leather and began to braid a new rein for Daisy. Her fingers moved with a practiced, steady rhythm, weaving the separate strands into a single, strong, and flexible whole. It was a meditation, a physical manifestation of the new understanding taking root in her heart. She found Matthew again at the livery stable, preparing his horse for the ride to the county seat, where he was scheduled to give a formal deposition. She walked up to him, holding the newly braided rein in her hands. It was a simple, beautiful thing, the leather dark and rich, the braid tight and even. She held it out to him. She said she had noticed his was getting worn. He stopped what he was doing and looked at the rein. Then at her face. He saw the question in her eyes, the quiet, profound offer she was making. Her voice was soft, but it held all the strength she had discovered within herself. She said, "If you want, we could ride the same trail." It was not a plea. It was not a surrender. It was a proposition between equals, a choice to join 2 paths into one. She was not asking him to save her or to lead her, but to ride beside her. Matthew looked at the rein, a symbol of guidance, of a shared journey, of knowing when to hold tight and when to give slack. He reached out and took it from her, his fingers closing over hers for a long moment. The leather was warm from her hands. He did not need words. His answer was in his eyes, a look of such profound acceptance and quiet joy that it made her heart feel full to bursting. He said there was no trail he would rather ride. The epilogue of Dusty Bell's struggle was written not in courtrooms, but in the actions of its people. The assets seized from Gideon March's ruined enterprise were, by a popular vote of the town council, placed into a new community trust. Its first act was to establish the Clean Creek Fund, dedicated to the slow, arduous work of healing the land they all called home, the miners. Under a new charter organized by Matthew and the town, formed a cooperative, ensuring they would share in the wealth and the responsibility of the work ahead. The red dust still blew on the autumn wind, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It was just the land, the hard, beautiful, and unforgiving country they had chosen. One clear, cold morning, 2 riders left town, heading north. Nora sat on Daisy, Matthew on his gray gelding, the newly braided rein held lightly in his hands. They rode side by side, not into a sunset, but into the bright, challenging light of a new day. Their path their own, their future a shared horizon. A year passed, the seasons turned, scouring the valley with winter winds and healing it with the green blush of spring. The scar left by the toxic sludge began to fade, covered over by new grass and wildflowers, a testament to the land's stubborn resilience. The town of Dusty Bell healed with it, not by forgetting, but by choosing, day by day, to build something new upon the ruins of the old. The autumn of the following year found the town transformed. A new schoolhouse stood near the church, its bell ringing out not an alarm, but to call children from their lessons. Its single room was filled with the scent of chalk dust and new pine, and the sound of young voices learning to read and to cipher. A small clinic had been established in what was once a dusty storage office, run by Sarah and a traveling doctor who now made Dusty Bell a regular and welcome stop on his circuit. The fevers in the children had long since broken, and the clean water that now flowed in Ash Creek was a promise kept. Nora stood at the head of that promise. She was the manager of the Dusty Bell Water Cooperative, a title that was less a position of power and more a statement of unending work. She spent her days riding the length of the valley, checking the new filtration systems built with funds from the community trust, negotiating water allotments with ranchers whose herds were now healthy and growing, and overseeing the painstaking work of reseeding the damaged floodplain. She was still the woman who ran the general store, but her ledger now held the accounts of an entire valley's health. She moved with a confidence that was no longer defensive, but was instead the quiet, earned authority of a builder. The whispers that had once followed her down the main street had been replaced by respectful greetings. She was no longer the Whitford spinster. She was Nora. Matthew, for his part, had fulfilled every clause of the contract he had signed on the counter of her store. The March Mine, now renamed the Aurora Cooperative, was a different kind of enterprise. The miners, who now held shares in the profits, worked with a purpose that went beyond a daily wage. They were partners in their own fortunes. Safety was no longer a begrudged expense, but a shared priority. New timbers shored up the tunnels, and ventilation shafts kept the air clean and cool. Evan, his hands now steady, served as the elected foreman, his wisdom and experience finally valued. They worked the earth not with the frantic greed of plunderers, but with the careful respect of custodians, knowing that the mountain's wealth was now tied directly to their own community's well-being. Nora and Matthew's life together was forged in the rhythm of this shared work. Their home, the expanded and repaired Whitford house, was often filled with plans and maps spread across the kitchen table. Their conversations were a tapestry woven from the price of lumber, the mineral content of a new ore sample, and the progress of the sickest child in the clinic. Their partnership was a living thing, built not on grand declarations, but on the million small, unspoken moments of a shared life, the way he would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for her when she came in from a long ride, the way she knew exactly how to argue a point with him to make him see its merit, the easy, comfortable silence that could stretch between them as they sat on the porch and watched the evening fall. One cool evening in October, they sat in that familiar silence, a single oil lamp, a permanent fixture on the porch railing now, threw a warm, golden light around them as the last of the sunset bled from the sky, leaving it a deep, bruised purple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, clean smell of the nearby creek. Matthew was reading a letter that had arrived on the afternoon stagecoach. It was from Evan's eldest son, a young man who had learned to write at the new school. He read the letter aloud, his voice a low, steady murmur in the growing twilight. The boy's script was careful and a little clumsy, but his words were clear. He wrote to thank them. He wrote that his father, for the first time in his life, felt like a man of substance. The share of the profits had allowed their family to buy 2 milk cows and to begin building a small house with real glass windows. But more than the money, the boy wrote, was the feeling of pride. His father no longer came home from the mine exhausted and defeated, but tired and proud, a man who was building a future for his children. The letter ended with a simple, heartfelt sentiment: "You have given us back our hope." Matthew folded the letter and set it on the small table between them. The paper glowed in the lamplight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the simple, powerful words filling the quiet. Nora looked out at the dark line of the mountains against the starry sky, a small, contented smile played on her lips. She turned to him, her eyes soft in the warm light. She asked him, her voice laced with a gentle, teasing humor, "Do you think people in town still say I am too stubborn to marry?" The words hung in the air, a ghost of the past, now stripped of all its power to wound. It was a fond look back at a version of herself she barely recognized, a woman encased in an armor of pride because she had never known the safety of a true partnership. She was still that woman. Her core of steel was not gone, but it had been tempered, made flexible and stronger by the trust she had both given and received. Matthew looked at her, his face full of a love that was as deep and as quiet as the valley night. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Let them," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I still call your courage the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The answer was a perfect echo, a renewal of the vow he had made not with rings or with promises, but with a simple statement of truth in the middle of a dusty town square. It was the foundation of everything they had built together. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night, the gentle, rhythmic murmur of the creek, now running clean and clear over the stones, was the only sound. It was the sound of life, of healing, down by the water's edge, caught in a patch of dark green moss. A single, tiny fleck of gold glittered in the starlight, a small, bright promise of the riches that could be found, not by blasting them from the earth, but by carefully tending to the world and to each other day by day. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.